I'm excited for our design keynote. I read online about one of their initiatives called Land on Water. And I'm curious to learn more about the design innovations that will help our urban spaces. So please welcome from Denmark, the founding partner of Mass, Marshall Blecher.
Hello, thank you so much for having me here. I've just flown in from Denmark where it's currently snowing, so this is a very nice change. And it's been great to hear some of the conversations and to meet some of you. This is a map of the world, obviously, where I've replaced water and land. And I think this image serves to remind us of the different value we place on water rather than land. We mainly use it to extract fish and to push ships around in. And I think we're slowly being reminded by the increasing prospect of sea level rise and by increased urban flooding that we've got to deal with our oceans as a critical part of the solution. And that's sort of the principle we founded MAST with. How can we create more climate-resilient cities, and how can we work with water rather than trying to work against it? But first, I'd just like to share a little bit more about why we chose this mission. This is actually where I'm from, in Australia, a small coastal town. But I somehow ended up in Denmark, in this flat, sort of featureless landscape, designing houses. And it's a job that I liked, and I still do it in my spare time. But I could see that there was a sort of limited impact that you can have designing these houses for mostly wealthy clients around Northern Europe. I'll just show a few of these projects, just because I think they're nice to look at. So I've tried to use innovative materials and make them as sustainable as possible. This one, for example, is built entirely of cross-laminated timber, highly insulated with wood wool and clad in steel panels. But even with the most sustainable materials, as I said, it's hard to make an impact with these small, high-end residential projects. So I always had something in the back of my mind, trying to make a larger impact, and one way I could see was to work with water and sort of investigate how we can better work with water to make more climate-resilient cities. While I was working as a sort of residential architect, I undertook a study tour around the world and visited different examples of floating communities. People have been living on water for thousands of years, and this community in Iraq, in the south of Iraq, people have been living like this on floating reed beds for around 7,000 years. They make these floating islands out of reeds, caked together with buffalo dung, and they actually move up and down with the water, providing a sort of safe place to live, despite the very unpredictable environment. This is Lake Makoko in Nigeria, where around 250,000 people have extended onto the lake, living in these sort of floating houses, as well as stilt houses, since there is a lack of affordable land. And these houses in Seattle are some of the last floating houses left in the west coast of America. There used to be many of these communities up and down the coast where loggers would take the logs that they'd cut down and use them as floating foundations for houses. But in the 50s, when they were clearing slums around the states, most of these communities were evicted. Some communities in Seattle organized together and managed to save these communities, which have since become some of the most desirable and expensive real estate in the city. So back in Denmark, I met up with another Danish architect, Magnus Marbjerg, who we founded the company together with. And Magnus has a very different background. He grew up on this ship. By the time I'd met him, he'd sailed around the Atlantic 7 times, and he'd experienced cities in this sort of forgotten way, sailing into the ports of major cities around Africa, the Caribbean, and North America. I think this is the image we have of the old day of sailing, when you would enter a city and be welcomed into the port. The city was really the interface to the world. Sorry, the harbor was really the interface to the world. This, for example, is a picture of Copenhagen's main harbor, taken at the turn of the century. And this is what it looks like today. So we have this enormous asset in so many cities around the world. In Copenhagen, it's by far the largest public space, but it's really lost its original purpose. It's no longer the interface with the world. It's at best, something for people to look at from their apartments. And we both saw an opportunity in reimagining the way cities relate to the harbors. And so we started MAST 3 years ago. We're actually based on the harbor in Copenhagen in one of the last shipbuilding yards in the city center. And that allows us to build things as well as design them. So we work with a team of shipbuilders and make a lot of small projects which we think can have a big impact on the way the city relates to the sea. And the first project was very small. You might know this symbol. It's familiar to us all, this sort of solitary desert island. We thought we would build this. And this is what we came up with. It's a 20 square meter platform with a single tree growing at the center. This was a small self-initiated project. We built it one winter, one very cold winter, and then towed it out into the city center without really telling anyone our plan. And people generally reacted really well to it. They were sort of surprised at first, but then the growing number of kayakers and swimmers and boaters in the harbor started using it for picnics and for small events. And it became a really popular fixture in the city. So this project got a lot of support from the city of Copenhagen and from the Port Authority, who eventually ended up supporting the development of the project into something much larger. So we're currently working on deploying a whole archipelago of floating islands around the city, which can be combined together to host large events or separated apart to activate smaller, underutilized parts of the harbor. This is a model of the next stage of the island project. And the idea is that these spaces basically behave like any other park in the city. They're totally free to use for anybody who wants to swim or boat or kayak out to them. We also work with the city to create new ways of accessing the water. This, for example, is a simple platform which allows people to launch their kayaks or to just meet for a coffee on the water side, which was previously inaccessible. We also work on a lot of private projects in Copenhagen. We make a lot of houseboats. There's a large stock of ferries which used to service the different islands around Denmark, and it's become very popular to convert these into homes. This is a small project, again, for the city of Copenhagen, where we've created a protected swimming zone, which can actually move around to different locations in the harbor and provide a new way for people to swim safely, especially for children. And in winter, after a sauna, it's a good place to jump in the water. And this is just a video, again, of us towing it through the city center and having a swim at the same time. We think there's an opportunity now with sort of improvements in off-grid technology to create totally off-grid floating housing. So this is a small project which we started developing for Hobart, but also for a project in Norway, where we are creating these totally off-grid rental accommodation units. So the idea is that they actually process sewage, collect water, and create enough electricity via solar panels and store it in batteries to live totally off-grid for extended periods. This is a video of the shipyard where we're building a CLT structure. This is a floating sauna, again for the municipality of Copenhagen. And this is going to be a public sauna. Eventually there'll be a collection of these moving around the city, providing everyone access to a sauna in winter and a safe place for swimming. We've started working around Europe. This is a project we're doing with Fulham Football Club in London on the upper reaches of the Thames. The idea is to create a new public transport link to service the community, but also to create a totally new type of public space in front of this new stadium building. So we're incorporating native planting as well as these floating reed beds. So the floating reed beds are essentially woven fabric with seeds and small plants embedded in it, which move up and down with the 6-meter tides and provide habitat and also clean the river water at the same time. The platforms provide a sort of spill-out space from the stadium and also a new public space which everyone can use. So this is a small animation showing the movement of the floating reed beds and also the movement of the floating river bus stop at the end. And the river bus stop was designed to also provide a public space, to work as an amphitheater where people can watch the canoe races and the kayak races which go up and down the river. This is a project we're developing in Milan, in Italy. So this is a former quarry which is at the center of an area called Sigrate. And this area has been lacking a sort of public square. So the idea was to create a new public park, a central park for this part of Milan, and to provide different buildings actually floating on the water which can move up and down with the groundwater throughout the seasons. So these buildings are floating on concrete foundations, and they're connected by adjustable bridges to the mainland. There's also I'll skip through, a collection of floating islands attached to this project. So floating in the center of the lake, there will be around 8 floating islands which provide a new type of public space, space which people can use for events, for weddings or for performances, or even rent out to camp on these islands overnight. But throughout all of these projects, we saw that there was some severe limitations with current technologies for building on water. The most common way of building on water at the moment is using floating concrete and styrofoam foundations. And that's quite an unflexible solution. So for example, if you build a house on a concrete pontoon and you add an extension or you add a piano, the whole house will tilt to the side, and it's very costly and difficult to mitigate that. Another solution for building on water is using steel, but steel typically has to be coated with anti-fouling paint, which is poisonous to the marine ecosystem. So we thought there was a solution which could both solve the flexibility and also create a better environment under the water. So we teamed up with Romberg Group, who are an Austrian developer who'd make a lot of timber housing, and we developed a totally new solution for building on water called Land on Water. And the idea is to create these simple modules out of reinforced polymers. We hope to use a majority recycled plastic in these. And these modules can fit together to form a variety of different spaces, either infrastructure or housing. This, for example, is a proposal for a floating campground for a city in the west of Denmark. The cages lock together and form a space frame structure. And they work a little bit like gabion cages. So gabion cages have been used, for example, for foundations for churches in Europe for hundreds of years. And they basically they store stones which create really stable and affordable foundations. We've sort of inverted that concept where we fill these cages with flotation elements and create very stable and also flexible floating foundations. These sort of top panels, which are connected to the cages, have inbuilt conduit for services and provide a space for insulation or even landscaping. We've worked with Romberg Group to incorporate their existing timber frame construction systems. So the idea is eventually you'll be able to buy kits which can be put together to build houses, for example. And we think there's an opportunity to create something which is a net positive for the environment that the house is built in, not just neutral. So the cages can actually provide perfect anchor points for seaweeds and for mollusks, and habitat for different animals underwater. And this shows a sort of fisheye view of one of the projects. And you can see that there's a different distribution of flotation in the cages depending on the weight which is put above it. So this is, as I said, really beneficial if you're going to adapt housing at a later point. there's also the potential to add new cages and to extend these and to create larger communities. So this is a proposal based on the land on water system, which we made with Romberg for Lake Constance in Austria. The idea was to create a totally off-grid floating community which produced its own food, collected its own water, and processed all of its own waste. And we think it's a perfect sort of laboratory for testing different technologies, since it's so visually disconnected from other services. So this is a view of the project. We found out that in the center of Lake Constance is some of the only international water in Europe. So the CEO of Romberg Group is really keen to build this thing and sort of tow it out in the middle of the night without telling anybody and see what happens. So we hope to build this, but we're also looking at developing a lot of other projects in the coming years around the world. We're working at the moment on a pavilion for the World Architecture Congress in Copenhagen next year, which will use seaweed as a construction material. So actually taking some of the resources from the ocean and building with them. So we're going to clad this large pyramidal structure in seaweed, and we're going to also grow seaweed on the underside of the pavilion. So it's only an experimental project, obviously, but in the future, maybe you could imagine growing your cladding underneath your house. And that's all I've got time for today, but I'm happy to talk to you afterwards and share some more of my projects. Thanks so much.